The Radio Wammo Breakfast.
Kiwi.
Well, it was announced yesterday that the Climate Science Coalition are taking Niwa, that is the state-owned weather and atmospheric research body, to court over their accuracy of their data. Niwa are being challenged that their data is inaccurate, and in fact it's been possibly fiddled with. Well, to talk with me about this is Gareth Renowden, who is the author of a book called Hot Topic, which was the first popular science book to examine global warming from a New Zealand perspective. Also a great website as well, hot-topic.co.nz. And Gareth joins us via live Skype video from his home in North Canterbury. Hello to you, Gareth.
Good morning, Glenn.
Now, this idea that the Climate Science Coalition they believe that Niwa have in some way fiddled the data and misrepresented it. Is that possible, Gareth?
I suppose in theory it would be possible, but it would imply that there was a conspiracy to mislead the public and so on about the New Zealand temperature record, but frankly is unbelievable, basically. I mean, they brought out a report before Christmas claiming that the New Zealand temperature record had been fiddled and that adjustments to various stations were not necessary. When it was pointed out that adjustments are absolutely necessary, for instance, if say in Hokitika, the position that they took, the temperatures changed in various times actually over the 150 odd years. You have to compensate for that because you could go from a hot spot to a cold spot or a warm, so you've got to take that into account when you put together a long series of temperature records. And so when they were to show that point, Niwa then produced what they called their 11 station series, which is made up from stations around the country where temperatures haven't had to be adjusted. So these are all stations with a long, continuous record. And they showed even more warming than the 7 station series that the Sceptics were getting so worried about. And basically, since then, they've been desperately trying to flog what appears to me to be a rather dead horse in order to make political points, basically.
Well, they're also saying that the New Zealand Meteorological Service has shown no warming during the past century, but Niwa has adjusted its records to show a warming trend of 1 degree.
I think it's the other way around, actually. What happens is that when you correct the temperature record for various changes, whether that could be changes, as I said, in station location, but it can also be for changes of thermometer or the box that the thermometers are collected. When you make those changes, you find that you get a warming. And there's actually some really good evidence that there has been a warming over the last 150 years, and that is that when the first Europeans were wandering around the South Island of New Zealand, they saw a lot of alpine ice. There were glaciers in many places down the Southern Alps. When you look at those same places today, you find that 50% of that ice has disappeared. And, they didn't disappear because the fairies came along and scattered ooffle dust. This is warming that's done it.
So what you're saying is, the evidence is there, it's stark, it's right there in front of us, all around us, but there are still a few of us, for some reason, who refuse to believe that it's happening.
Yeah, well, I would put the climate skeptics, they're not what you would call, they're certainly not doing science. They're not attempting to publish in the peer-reviewed literature. They're not attempting to make any kind of academic case for changes. All they want to do is to make noise and try and persuade the public and politicians that we don't need to do anything about climate. Now, why they want to do that, well, your guess is as good as mine. And we have very good evidence that in the US particularly, large fossil fuel companies have been funding campaigns against action on climate change. I'm not sure whether any of that money has come to New Zealand, but if you look at who's making the most noise and you look at their supporters in Parliament, who are the ACT Party, I think we can see that there's a kind of noisy rump of people who don't want to do anything on climate change for political reasons. Now, I find that absolutely sickening at a time when, climate change is having severe impacts around the world, with the Russian heat wave and millions affected by floods in Pakistan.
Yeah, exactly. So this court challenge comes at a time when all that is happening overseas, but also some fresh new data being released from the NOAA as well. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, the latest data is that if you look at the global temperature, we are now warmer than any time in the instrumental history. The July was the second warmest month ever. And the January to July period was the warmest January to July ever recorded. So it's absolutely unequivocal that the world is warming. What happens in New Zealand is frankly irrelevant in terms of what happens around the globe. We could be cooling actually, and it would still make no difference to the need for action on climate change. Frankly, we've got to try and do something to stop the sorts of horrendous impacts that we're seeing in Russia and Pakistan and China happening everywhere around the world.
That data that you just told us about, is that an overall global trend, or was that just Northern Hemisphere summer? How does that figure?
The actual figures are done by looking at temperature data from all around the world, on land and on ocean. And basically they have a technique to aggregate all this data and produce one number, which was, I think, about 16.5 degrees Celsius was the average for July, about 0.68 degrees, I think, over the 20th century average. So, I mean, it doesn't sound like much, but the difference between an ice age, which is what we were having about 20,000 years ago, and our current climate is only 5 degrees Celsius. And yet we're expecting to see anywhere north of 3 degrees Celsius in the next 100 years. I think that's a sobering prospect.
It is. Yeah, I just saw an interesting documentary the other day called Crude, and it brings up the theory that we're just burning these fossil fuels, these carbon molecules that were buried millions of years ago and eventually in the form of oil, and we're using that, we're burning that up in our cars. And we are now accelerating the process of putting that carbon atom back into the atmosphere and then eventually back under the earth again, which is a natural process, but we're accelerating it. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. Certainly there is a natural carbon cycle, but what we're doing effectively by burning fossil fuel is we're burning stored sunlight. Basically, the carbon molecules that are in oil and coal were laid down by trees and vegetation and stuff millions of years ago, and the energy came from the sun at that time. So as we burn that fossil fuel, we're basically borrowing energy from hundreds of millions of years ago. So, that carbon doesn't belong in our atmosphere now. It was part of the carbon cycle when the fossil fuels were laid down. Basically, we've added 40% to the amount of carbon in the atmosphere since the 1850s. And it would be a miracle if that wasn't having an effect on the atmosphere.
So there is no grey line in this. This is really black and white science. I mean, it's so obvious to me. Yet again, I hate to bring up the Science Coalition again, but why do they have science in their name? Why are they calling themselves scientists when they cannot agree with this?
I think it's public relations, It's a PR campaign. They want if you like, the people who don't know what's going on, the general public who don't particularly have a great interest in climate or weather, they want them to believe that there's an argument going on. And that argument was over a long, long time ago. I mean, I tend to liken it to imagining that you're coming to a junction in the road and there's a signpost, okay? And the signpost, if you turn left, takes you one way, the right takes you to the other. Now, we're absolutely confident that if you turn right, you're going to get to Hokitika. But we don't exactly know how far it is. So we are absolutely confident that if we keep pumping carbon into the atmosphere, the climate system is going to respond by warming. And the more carbon we put in, the hotter it's going to get. Can we tell you how hot it's going to be in 2050? Well, probably no, we can't, because we don't know, first of all, how much carbon we're going to spin out over that time. And what's most worrying is that we don't really know how the climate system is going to respond. We can have a very good guess, but that's not the same thing as knowing exactly what's going to happen. And really that sort of uncertainty isn't something that means we should do nothing. It's something that means we should get really, really worried.
I certainly am. You certainly are. Let's hope everyone else who's listening is as well.
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. It frustrates me immensely that people like the Climate Science Coalition seem to be able to get traction with their arguments. Some people don't want to do anything because it's comfortable not to do anything, and I think that's their constituency, really.
Gareth Renowden from Hot Topic, hot-topic.co.nz. Thanks so much for your time this morning.
No worries, Glenn. Been a pleasure.